All right. Thank you, Dennis. My name is David G. I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic and a grateful recovering sexaholic. I have a sobriety date in both programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, sober since August 8th of 1994, Sexaholics Anonymous since October 1st, 2019. Very grateful to be here today. Always grateful to come out and do anything with the big book or share experience, strength, and hope. And that's really what we've been doing for the past several weeks since this has started. You know, we've started at the front of the book and we've made it all the way over to the 4-step inventory. And for a long time in the program, I didn't realize that there were 3 sections to inventory. I know my first year, I had a lot of trouble, a lot of discomfort just being sober. It was pretty miserable, in fact. And I can remember talking to a man and him saying, "Let me ask you a couple of questions." He said, have you completed all 3 sections of inventory? And I said, I didn't know there was 3 sections to the inventory. And he said, "And what about the amends? Have you completed the amends process, all of them, except for those that would have been entered?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I know what the problem is." And I said, "Well, great. Can you enlighten me on what that is?" And he said, "You've never worked the program as outlined in the book, and therefore you're sick, and that won't last. Just being sober will not last. At some point, something tragic will happen, and you won't have the tools to deal with that, and you'll go back." And he was absolutely right. So I was grateful to be led through the book. I don't claim to have all the experience in the program, and I'm not saying that this is the only way for you. I'm saying it's the only way for me that I ever found was to stick close to the directions, to not only learn how to be sober, but to recover from a state of mind that is out to kill me. So this part of the inventory is very vital. When it says resentment is the number 1 offender, I absolutely agree with that 100%. Anger seems to take me away quicker than anything else does. It seems to cut me off from the sunlight of the spirit. It dampens my relationships with you and others. And it's just a horrible, horrible place to be. I have found through this work that I still get angry from time to time. The good news is I don't hold on to anger anymore. The book says if we were to live, we had to be free of anger. And I don't think that means that I will completely never be angry again. However, I do believe that with these tools, I'm able to get away from that anger pretty quick, make amends quickly if I've harmed anyone, and turn my thoughts towards someone else. And these instructions that we have been in this part of the book is really going to enlighten us in our 10-step work. It just is a huge part of it. So we ended last week there on page 67. And on page 66, we looked at 7 different times that he had mentioned on that page that anger was going to kill us if we didn't get free of it. And we went through that pretty thoroughly. When we got to the top of page 67, we looked at it where it said, though we did not like their symptoms, and that was column 2 of our inventory. And the way that these disturbed us, which was column 3 in our inventory, they, like ourselves, were sick too. And that was good news to me because I felt like I was the only one. My disease, I'm either greater than or less than all the time. But my prayer work starts right here. We ask God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. And so the exercise that I was given to do with each name on my list was to take an event that had happened in my life when somebody was in the hospital bed sick and dying, and I had so much compassion for them, and I prayed, and I just really, really wanted that person to get better. I was to take that same person, take them out of that hospital bed and put each person on my list there and try to have the same compassion and understanding that I had for that person. Well, that person turned out to be my grandson. When he was just a little guy, we just about lost him. And I can remember it was a horrible time. And I just had so much compassion and was so moved. And so each person on my list, he was out of the bed. They were in the bed. And I did this prayer. God, please help me show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that I would cheerfully grant little James. That was his name. So when a person offended, and this isn't only in the inventory work, this is moving forward in my life. Even to this day, I have to use this. And I've been finished with the inventory work for some time. Moving forward, when a person offends, we say to ourselves, this is a sick man. Now, I don't need to look at this as a sick man from a place of judgment, and that's what I had always done. Nah, that's a sick man there, you know. No, I want to look at it more from compassion. God, this is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? Save me from being angry, thy will be done. And if you remember the directions on page 64, it asks us to make a list of people, places, and institutions with whom we were angry. So this is a connector to that. And we're looking, save me from being angry, thy will be done. We avoid retaliation and argument. That has never been me prior to this work. I always want to retaliate. I always want to argue. And I'm always right, or I think I am. It says we wouldn't treat sick people that way. If we do, we destroy our chance of being helpful. That's a promise. We will destroy that chance. We cannot be helpful to all people, but at least God will show us how to take a kindly and tolerant view of each and every one. What a promise. Each and every one that was on that list. If I will do this prayer work, it is telling me that I will have a kindly and a tolerant view. In a spiritual awakening, I'm going to have to view things differently. And so right here is one of the first promises of that I'm going to begin to awaken, and anger is going to move away, and I'm going to be able to feel some peace and love and joy and understanding. I'm going to be able to connect with my fellow man. And man, what a beautiful thing this has turned out to be. Now, referring to our list again, remember, we wrote the list. We set it aside. We come back, we did columns 1, column 2, column 3. We've done the prayer work, assuming we have done the prayer work up to this point. With my guys, we stop, and before we ever move into the 4th column, the prayer work has to be complete. We have to do the prayer work, which is every name on that list, and we do that as I've just described from the top of page 67 down. And once that is done, now if there is anything that is still there, if 1 or 2 people are still there that we haven't forgiven, we really need to get rid of that before moving on, because if there's any unforgiveness in our hearts, then we're going to suffer. This isn't going to mean a whole lot. Now, last week we looked at a prayer that helps us in the back of the book, and quickly I would just like to take another look at that to recap on the bottom of page 551 in your book. If you have a 4th edition, I just kind of want to recap on that, because before we ever move into this 4th column, this forgiveness has to be in place. It just has to be. Now, this was a story of a lady, and the story in the back of the book is freedom from bondage. And she had a huge resentment with her mother for about 25 years. Now, I can relate to that automatically. But she had been sober for a little while, and she realized that she had to get rid of that resentment, or she was going to drink again. We realized that, or we're going to act out again. Lust is going to hit us. We're going to act out. And it's happened over and over for me, and for many of you I know as well. Let's look at that bottom paragraph on page 551. And again, I know that we done that last week, but let's recap just a little bit. Here's what she did. One morning, however, she says, I realized I had to get rid of it. And if you read the paragraph before, it explains the resentment was against her mother. But she said, I realized I had to get rid of it. Now, that's the first thing that we need to do. We need to realize that we need to get rid of this resentment. For our reprieve was running out. And if I didn't get rid of it, I was going to get drunk. And in a lot of our cases, we're going to act out. And I didn't want to act out, or in her words, drunk anymore. Look at the second thing she did. First thing she did was she realized it. Here's the next thing she done. In my prayers that morning, I asked God to point out some way for me to be free of this resentment. And once I realized that, the next thing I need to do is go to prayer. Now, this is pretty much telling us the same thing in these directions back over here on 67. She says, during the day, a friend brought me some magazines to take to a hospital group I was interested in. So look at the third thing she did. She became of service. She became willing to become of service. She realized she had the resentment, needed to get rid of it. She asked God to show her. She became willing to do some service work. And let's look what happened. The answer fell right in her lap. And for us, this is the same thing. It works this way just about every time. I looked through them. A banner crossed. One featured an article by a prominent clergyman in which I caught the word resentment. He said, in effect, if you have a resentment and you want to be free of it, now that should be our first question. If we have one and we wish to be free of it, here's what we're going to need to do. He said, if you will pray for the person or the thing that you resent, you will be free. What a promise. Now, if you will ask for everything that you want for yourself to be given to them, you will be free. Now, that's a different take on prayer for me. I've never done that. I've never really asked that everybody else have what I want out of life. So ask for their health, their prosperity, their happiness, and you will be free. Now, here's the key for me. Even when you don't really want it for them and your prayers are only words and you don't mean it, go ahead and do it anyway. Do it every day for 2 weeks and you will find you have come to mean it and you will want for them. And you will realize that where you used to feel bitterness and resentment and hatred, you now feel compassionate, understanding, and love. It worked for me then, and it's worked for me many times since. Now, when I was 4 years sober in AA, I'd adopted 2 little girls that had come out of a drug-infested home, and they were just, it was just a terrible deal. They were scared to death of a fly flying around them. They were just scared of everything. And so we took them in, and man, we got their health back and things. And so a family member had left a lot of money to one of the little girls if something were to ever happen to him. Well, something did happen to him, and he ended up passing away. But what happened was he didn't change his life insurance policy. The person, which was their mother, was still on there, and she had never been taken off, and the girl putting on. And so all this time I expected, man, I'm going to get this big chunk of money because now we have this little girl, and it didn't turn out that way. The mother got the money, and she ended up fleeing and taking out. And I was so angry over that. I was so angry that I wanted to kill her. In fact, I was 4 years sober, and I was carrying a .38 snub-nosed pistol in my pickup every day, hoping that I would see her because, I'd had a long history of violence with guns and stuff like that. So thank God that didn't come to be. But this resentment was killing me. And so I did exactly what that story asked us to do in the back of the book. And by God's grace, I never did see that woman until many years later. And the resentment went away just like the book said it was. So if we do this work, it will work. If we don't, it's probably going to fester and grow. And in my case, could have led to some very serious consequences. So I'm very grateful for that prayer, and I use it a lot. And for the guys that I work with, whenever we get to this part, if there's 1 or 2 that they're still holding on to, we go to that prayer and we use that until that's all gone. Then we're going to become willing to move into the 4th column. Let's take a look at the directions, middle of the page. Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others have done. Column 2 doesn't matter anymore. We're not looking at that anymore. We're done there. We're going to resolutely look for our own mistakes. Now, a lot of people say, I look for my part. My book doesn't say that. If you have a part, then I have a part. I don't want to look for my part. I want to look for my mistake. Now, here's what I'm going to do. We talked about this last week. On the front of the page, there's the example on page 65, if you will just hold your place and look at it real quickly. The example says this: I'm resentful at the cause and the effect. Now, you don't see column 4 there. What we do is on the back side, say if you were to flip your page over, if you were looking at 66 in your notebook, that page would be blank. And there's going to be 4 questions that we're going to ask right here. Where had I been selfish? We're going to write that down. We're going to skip 4 or 5 lines, and we're going to ask ourselves this question: where had I been dishonest? We're going to skip 4 or 5 lines, and we're going to ask ourselves this question: where had I been self-seeking? Skip 4 or 5 lines, we're going to ask ourselves this question: where had I been frightened? We're going to do some inventory work here. Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, doesn't matter. At this point, it doesn't matter anymore. We tried to disregard the other person entirely. Here's going to be my last question. Skip 4 or 5 lines after the word frightened. I'm going to ask myself this: where were we to blame? Now, I've never asked myself this question before. In fact, I don't really know how to answer that question without doing the prayer work. So the prayer work is very important here. Remember, there was no amen after step 3. So we are still very much in prayer and action, prayer and action. Where were we to blame? Now, the strangest thing is whenever I get this work done and I take a look at that last question, if I will flip my page back over and look at column 2, that usually the same thing that I'm blaming them for and hating them for is the very thing that I've done. And I see it right here. This is what we call a turnaround, and the turnaround in our thinking. In other words, this is where the magic happens in this part of the inventory. The resentment, the shame, all the stuff that I have felt for years and years, that we have handled a lot of that through the prayer work. I've taken a look at my mistake, and I'm beginning to get free here. For the first time in my life, I'm beginning to get free. I'm starting to see things differently. What a beautiful place to be. Look at what the book says. The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We use a black pen and a white piece of paper. We're going to stick as close to the letter of the book as possible. We admitted our wrongs honestly, and we were willing to set these matters straight. So there is some steps 8 and 9 work in those 2 sentences there. We're going to admit our wrongs honestly. Now we're going to do that whenever we get over here to step 5. And then we're going to become willing to set these matters straight. We're going to do that in steps 8 and 9. If we have done this work up to this point, that completes that part of the inventory, which is resentment. And there's a lot of work there. There really is. You can ask some of the guys that are on the call today. There's a lot of work involved there. But it's very freeing, and our very lives depend on it as sexaholics, or at least mine does. I know that. So the biggest part of the inventory writing is out of the way, but we still have 2 more sections to go. And one of the big things for we sexaholics, alcoholics, and other things that I've always noticed has been fear. Fear continues to come around even after I sober, especially after I sober up. And it always seems to lead me back if I'm not careful. Now, they always told me that fear was resentment with a bow tie on. And we want to take a look at why that is. He says, notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown's, Mr. Jones, the employer, and the wife. If you'll hold your place right there for a second and flip back to page 65, and you will look at column number 3. This is what he's talking about. Over where it says affects my. See how fear is bracketed alongside there in column 3? Now, if there was any fear and resentment with this connection, I need to put that down, because this is going to help me in my fear list right here whenever I begin to write it. So that's what he means by that sentence. Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside up. He says this short word somehow touches about every aspect of our life, and it really does. It was an evil and a corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. The dog soldier is a Cheyenne Indian, and one of the methods of poisoning you to death would be to cut you open and put a poison feather within you and sew that back up. And you don't die immediately. You die very slowly, very painfully. And it's just a horrible way to die. And it's almost like fear is here. It says it's an evil and a corroding thread. We're sewn up with this stuff. The fabric of my existence, I mean, I just exist from that. And when I'm in my disease, was shot through with it. It sets in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. Man, that sounds like a whole lot of words that I don't really understand. And I'm like, what does this mean? And my grand sponsor tells the story of sometimes almost like a self-fulfilled prophecy, this motion trains of circumstances that brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. The book says, but did we not ourselves set the ball rolling? And he gave an example of he had met a lady in the program that he really liked, and he had started dating her, and he was very happy, but he was also very fearful that that relationship wouldn't last based on the relationships that he had had in the past. And so one of the things he'd done was he began to watch her. He began to stalk her when she wasn't around. She'd get up, go to the restroom. He'd go through her purse to make sure in her phone she hadn't called anybody else. I mean, he was just so afraid that this fear was driving him to do all of these things. Well, one day she found this out, and of course she was very angry, and she left him. And so his mind told him automatically, see, you never were good enough for her to begin with. We told you. And so it's almost, that's what that sentence refers to, that self-fulfilling prophecy. We set in motion trains of circumstance which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. He absolutely felt like he didn't deserve that. But did he not himself set the ball rolling because of what he had done on his actions based on fear? And every one of us have stories to tell there, I know. It says, sometimes we think fear ought to be classed with stealing. It seems to cause more trouble. How? That was my question. How does that cause more trouble for me? Well, fear is like a thief. It steals my joy. It steals my serenity. It steals my conscious contact. We looked at some of those examples over there on page 46 back when we were in We Agnostics about the starlit night, and it was fleeting and soon lost. And we looked at the examples there. And that's kind of how this is. It just steals everything. What was stealing, it really seems to cause more trouble in my case. Absolutely. So let's look at the inventory instructions as they're laid out in the book here. We reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we had no resentment in connection with them. Period. I stopped right there. I make myself a list of the fears I have. Now, I didn't list the people. Obviously, I put fear along, was bracketed along column 3 over there. So I took a look at some of my fears when I was over there when it comes to people. I want to take a look at some things that I have been deathly afraid of in my life. One of them was flying in a plane. I was just deathly scared of heights for some reason, and I just didn't want anything to do with that. And as I get through the inventory, I begin to see why. And we will go into that a little more here in just a few minutes. So that's going to be our first column. It says we ask ourselves why we had them. There's column 2. Was it because self-reliance failed us? There's column 3. Self-reliance was as good as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. Some of us once had great self-confidence, but it didn't fully solve the fear problem or any other. When it made us cocky, it was worse. And so I've got this work here, and now I'm not going vertically up and down like I did in my resentments. I'm going horizontally across with this inventory. So let's take a look at this. I have asked Dennis to show us an example here. And I thought that we might kind of walk through a couple of fears the way I do it in the book, just to show you how I do this. Now, if you look at column 1, there's the fear. If you look at column 2, why do I have the fear? We looked at that here at the top of page 68. Does self-reliance fail us? But there's another column there. There's a column 4, and where do we see that at? So let's look on down the book just a little ways. If you go to the middle of the page where it says we never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator, we can laugh at those who think spirituality a way of weakness. Paradoxically, it's the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. Men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let him demonstrate through us what he can do. We ask him to remove our fear. And here's our column 4. Direct our attention to what he would have us be. So if you will look at that column 4 in that example, what would our Creator have me be? For a long time, I thought that said what he would have me do, but it doesn't say that. What would he have me be? Now, I know that there's people on here that have done 4 steps in other ways. And there again, I'm not saying that my way is the way, but this is the way that I do it based on my experience, strength, and hope. If your sponsor has you doing that another way, I encourage you to listen to your sponsor. This is the way the book outlines it for me. Let's take a look at one. Let's type in the word death. Column 1. Why do I have this fear? For me, it's unknown. So let's put that. So I know what I've read about it, but I don't really know how I feel about it at this point. So I do know that it's unknown. I see sometimes it's painful. Let's put that in there. And uncertainty. Let's put uncertainty there. Now, did self-reliance fail me? Column 3. That's a yes or no question. Well, of course, most of us say, yes, absolutely it did. Well, how did it fail me? Well, I try to manage this in this area of life. For me, I want to do all of these things, or I want to come up with all this stuff. I want to try to manage my own destiny here. And what's happening is I'm continuing to relapse and over and over and over, and I'm putting myself in harm's way every single day with death. Now, column 4, what would my Creator have me be? He would have me to be unafraid, joyful, peaceful, sober, and able to carry the message. Now let's look at the prayer work. We did prayer work with the resentments. There's prayer work we're going to have to do here. Look at it there in the middle of the page, about the last 3 to 4 paragraphs, where starting with, they trust their God. They never apologize for God. Instead, we let him demonstrate through us what we can do. Now here's our prayer work. We ask him to remove our fear. Look there in column 1. See the word death? I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to ask him to remove my fear of death. And I'm going to ask him to direct my attention to what he would have me be. Look at column 4. What he would have me to be is unafraid, joyful, peaceful, sober, and able to carry the message. I'm going to leave these middle 2 columns out. It doesn't matter anymore. I'm not relying on self anymore at this point. I'm relying on God because I'm using prayer. I'm not afraid of this fear anymore because I'm starting to attack it the only way I know how, and that's with prayer. So with the prayer work, the prayer says this, relating to that. God, please remove my fear of death and direct my attention to what you would have me to be, which is unafraid, joyful, peaceful, sober, and able to carry the message. And I'm going to continue with this prayer work over and over and over until I feel peace in this area. I'm no longer afraid of death anymore like I was when I first came to this program. So let's look at another one. Relapse. That's a big one for most of us. A lot of us are afraid of that. Why do I have that fear? My history shows that I relapse often. Let's put that in there. I hurt others. Put that in column 2 as well. Now let's look at column 3. Did self-reliance fail me? Yes. But how? Because my history always shows that I relapse and I hurt people. That's what I do. Column 4. What would my Creator have me be? Sober. Column 4, yeah. Sober. Working the program. Trusting God. Less David. I don't need more God. I need less David. Let's look at the prayer work. Looking at the prayer again. Pretty simple by now. I'm pretty sure we got it. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let him demonstrate through us what he can do. Now, he's done that. Many of us are sober on this call today, and many of you for a lot of years. God done that. We ask him to remove our fear. So my prayer would be, God, please remove my fear of relapse and direct my attention to what he would have me to be, which is sober, working the program, trusting God, and less David. I'm going to do this prayer work with each fear that came up. And I'm going to take a very close look at these fears. Look at one of the most beautiful promises in the book. At once we commenced to outgrow fear. How could we not? We're no longer focused on the fear all by itself. We're looking at what God can do, have me do, and do for us in column 4. I'm no longer relying on me. I'm relying on him. And I'm beginning to get results. And I'm beginning to be free of resentment. My fears are starting to melt away slowly. And I'm starting to wake up spiritually. And I'm beginning to become a part of this thing now. I'm beginning to see how it works. At this point, my sponsor tells me it's time to carry the messages that's been given to you. So I start searching out and bringing people through this work, starting back at 1 and bringing them up through. Now, what my step 10 and 11 work looks like before I get here and what my step 10 and 11 work looks like after I get here is completely different, because now I understand more of what they're talking about over in step 10, which we're not there, but we should probably take a quick peek at just for a second on page 84 of this book, if you will flip with me. This thought brings us to step 10, middle of the page. This thought brings us to step 10, which suggests we continue to take personal inventory and continue to set right any new mistakes as we go along. We vigorously commence this way of living as we cleaned up the past, and that's what we're doing over there in steps 4 through 9. We have entered the world of the spirit. I remember asking my sponsor, if I'm entering that world, where have I been all this time? And he said, preparing to enter that world. And so that's what I was doing with the 4-step work. Our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. This is not an overnight matter. It should continue for a lifetime. So here it is. Continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. Remember, we looked pretty close at that in the 4th column in our resentment inventory. We took a close look at that, and we also asked ourselves this question: where were we to blame? Now we have a better idea of what this is asking us to do over here because we've done it back over there. Since 4 through 9 is what's going to bring the awakening, 10 is going to ask us to do 4 through 9 every day from now on. When these crop up, not if, when. So they're coming. Here's my prayer. We ask God at once to remove them. That sounds like some 6-step work to me. We discuss them with someone immediately. That sounds like some 5th-step work to me. We make amends quickly. That sounds like 8 and 9. If we have harmed anyone, then we resolutely turn our thoughts to someone we can help. And that sounds like some 12-step work. Love and tolerance of others is our code. And by this time, we've ceased fighting anything or anyone. But look at this beautiful promise right here. For by this time, sanity will have returned. Now, if I've missed this work back over here on page 64 through 70, I mean, I can do it until I get to that point in the work. But if I'm unwilling to do this part of the work, I've seen it over and over. It just does not work out. I continue to stay sore, mad at other people. I'm full of fear in some form or another. And it just always, for me, leads back to acting out over and over. So very, very good instructions here. A lot of stuff to look at. And we have now looked at the resentment inventory, which is the first section. We've looked at the fears, which is the second. There's one more section of inventory that we're going to need to do. And that's at the bottom of page 68, where it says now about sex. We're probably going to take a look at this next week. That way we can go through it pretty much line by line. This is why most all of us are here. I know it's why I'm here. I was sober for a long time in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I had an awakening my first year out there that lasted all these years. I've studied and worked through this book many, many times, and I've followed the directions as close as I could possibly get. But I always, always, always relapsed with lust over and over and over. I could never get sober there. And I tried and tried. I've been trying since 1995 to get sober from lust and sexual acting out. And it didn't get any better. It got worse. I mean, there were periods of time when I felt like I was gaining ground and I was starting to do a little better, but something would always happen and then I'd always fall back. And so a year ago, a little more than a year ago now, I was asked with a friend to do a big book study down in Shreveport, Louisiana for a tri-state conference. And we had went down to do this. And my time was up with lust. I was caught and I knew it. Some people had got a hold of some information that I had left on some messages. And, this information was coming to my wife and it was going to the district and it was going to a lot of things, a lot of places. And I got a call asking me not to do any more circuit speaking or any more book studies until I could find myself getting right in this area of my life. And I just didn't know if I could do that. Well, all of that did come out at that tri-state conference, and my wife was very hurt. It was a terrible, terrible time. I just didn't think I was going to be able to finish the conference, but I did. Thank God I was able to. There were so many people that got hurt over that, not just my wife. My partner that I do these big book studies with out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, that has more than 33 years of sobriety and work in this book. And, I was a sponsee of Charlie's and he was a sponsee of Joe's. So we were just kind of carrying that legacy on as best we could. And so it really hurt him and it hurt his wife and it hurt a whole lot of people just by that. So I pulled away and I came to Sexaholics Anonymous, and it was here for the first time in my life. Now, this hadn't been my first trip to Sexaholics Anonymous. I'd been around here before and relapsed and was gone for a long, long time and just continued to relapse. But anyway, this time back, it was somewhat different. I came here with a willingness unlike I'd ever had before, and I think that gift of desperation is a beautiful thing. I think we need that. Without that, it's hard for some of us to get sober. It really is. And so I came back through this work this time, and when I got up to this part of the inventory, I was willing to take a look at this unlike I ever had before. And so next week, we want to look at this pretty in depth. A lot of people will do 4 columns here. Some people will do 5. The way that I read the book and the way that it's outlined, and I'll have some examples to throw out the same way we did with the fear, we're going to look at 11 columns of inventory. And this is something that I never had seen before, ever. And I've read this book over and over and over, studied this book over and over and over. But there's one question in the middle of page 69, the very last thing it says, we got this all down on paper and looked at it. And I had never done that. I had used Joe and Charlie inventories, and you pretty much just checked as you went along. Was I selfish? Yes. Check, 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 check. Well, the book doesn't ask me to do any of that. And so those men absolutely knew what they were doing, and I respect them, and they've helped more people, my God, than I could ever even dream of, including myself. So I have nothing to say bad about that. But I do have to say this. I'm going to stick to the letter of this book because I'm dealing with a different beast over here when it comes to lust. That's something, I can stay away from the convenience store. I can stay away from the bar room. I can stay away from the liquor store. I can stay away from the dope house. But all of that lives right inside of here when it comes to lust. And I can't get rid of that. I just can't. And so this is something that I'm going to take a look at very closely. So great stuff here. And without it, for me, I just could never stay sober. I could get sober. I just couldn't stay sober. So I want to thank you all for coming out and listening to me today. I hope some of it helped someone. There again, if it's something your sponsor has showed you something different, I encourage you to do what he asked you to do, because I know that I'm going to with mine. I have a sponsor here now that I respect and love very much. And there's some things that we're doing in this work as well now that has been very, very helpful to me. We haven't taken away from anything. We've only added to. And it's been a very good experience. And I'm glad to be here. Thanks for letting me share, Dennis.